Welcome back to Coloring Through the Bible. My name is Keegan Harkins, and today we're taking a look at Exodus chapter 9. What a chapter this is. There is so much packed into this chapter that it just really excites me, which maybe sounds horrible considering that Exodus 9 is telling us about the 5th, 6th, and 7th plagues that God sent against Pharaoh and the Egyptians. However, there are three beautiful themes which run through this chapter. The first one is found in verses 5 and 6. We read, "The Lord set a time and said, 'Tomorrow the Lord will do this in the land.' And the next day, the Lord did it." God always does what he says he will do according to his timetable. What an important lesson for us to write on our hearts. God's not unaware of our circumstances, and this chapter really points that out. God knows exactly the right timeline for the events in our life. So when we've been praying and asking God for him to move in our lives, and we haven't seen anything yet, we just need to remember that God's timing is better than our timing. That's one of the absolute hardest things for me to do. I get an idea in my head and I want it now. I want it to have happened yesterday, but that's not always the way God works. Now, sometimes, like in Exodus 9, God says it and then the next day he does it. But sometimes, like in the case of Abraham, God says it and the wait stretches out years and decades. But no matter how long we have to wait, we can trust that if God says it, he'll do it. All the promises in the Bible are ours. We can trust them. We can rely on God who spoke them because he always does what he says he'll do. The second amazing theme in this chapter is revealed to us in verse 19. God tells the Egyptians through Moses, "Give an order now to bring your livestock and everything you have in the field to a place of shelter, because the hail will fall on every man and animal that has not been brought in and is still out in the field, and they will die." Also, in verse 31, it talks about the crops that were destroyed because of the hail, the flax and the barley. But then in verse 32, we read, "The wheat and the spelt, however, were not destroyed because they ripened later." These verses reveal to us that God doesn't want pain from us, but rather obedience. And he'll provide for us even in the midst of our punishments. As devastating as these plagues were, they didn't bring about the complete devastation to Egypt. I mean, even in the midst of God's judgment and punishment, God showed mercy. He gave the people time to prepare and protect themselves and their livestock. Verses 20 and 21 tell us that the people who believed and feared God, who were obedient to his command to bring everybody in from the fields, they did what God had said and they were spared. But the ones who had this stubborn unbelief paid for it by the death of their livestock, the death of their servants, anybody who was out in the field. If they ignored God's command, they were killed by the hail. But the people who listened to God's warning were spared. And also, so we talk about everything being destroyed, all these crops being destroyed, but God didn't leave them without sustenance. I mean, I can imagine it was an incredibly hard year. They lost half of their crops. It would definitely be something that affected their lives. But even with the destruction of half of their crops, flax was one of the things that was said was destroyed. And flax was used to make linen, their clothing and ropes. And barley was used to make bread, but that could easily be replaced with the wheat and the spelt, which wasn't destroyed. So God definitely put an impact, but he didn't leave them just completely hopeless. He left them with a way of making it through, but it was also a reminder that would have stuck with them all year. I mean, as their clothes started to wear out, they would be reminded that, oh, well, we can't make more linen because, the flax crop was completely destroyed, and that'll be a reminder. And yet they would still have the food they needed to survive. So God is holy and just, but he's also compassionate and merciful. And that leads us to the last theme of the chapter. God provides and protects his children, those who believe and trust him. See, verse 7 tells us that Pharaoh set men to investigate and found that not even one of the animals of the Israelites had died. And verse 26 tells us the only place it did not hail was the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were. Again and again, God made the distinction between his children and the people who had set themselves up as his enemies. I mean, notice with this warning to the Egyptians to bring everyone in from the field, he wasn't just protecting the Israelites. If his motivation was just to protect the Israelites and just totally, wipe out everybody else, he wouldn't have given them a chance. He wouldn't have told them this is going to happen, prepare for it. But instead, he protected everyone who listened and obeyed. Because God isn't a God who arbitrarily just sends plagues and destruction on the earth. And yes, sometimes good people get swept up in the evil of the world, but we're never out of his eyesight. He doesn't send us trials simply for the joy of watching us run in fear. God has a purpose and a plan and a timeline that he's going to stick to. He prepares us for what he calls us to go through, and he never leaves our side, even when it looks like everything is lost. So we can trust him. We can cry out to him because he cares about our prayers. He cares about our lives. We should obey him because he's worthy. Because it's better to watch the hail from the safety of the window than to experience it because we're stubbornly out in the field. God's going to do what it takes to get our attention because our eternal soul is worth so much more to him than our temporary comfort. So I hope that as you read Exodus 9, you can look past the plagues and the nasty, sad part of it and see that even through all of this judgment and plagues against Egypt, God was being merciful. He wasn't completely destroying. He wasn't acting out in anger. He was offering them again and again a way out, and he was providing for them even in their stubbornness, and even though they had rebelled and earned this judgment, he didn't leave them completely without anything. And that's the same thing he does for us. He wants to get our attention. He wants us to believe in him. And that is so much more important than whether or not we're comfortable in the here and now. So I don't want God to have to use drastic measures to get my attention. I want to listen to him now. And I hope that you can agree with me that that is much more pleasant to obey than to have to go back and live through trials because we're being stubborn. So I hope that you've been encouraged today to find God in the midst of the storm, in the midst of your trial, because he's always there. Have a truly blessed day, and I will see you tomorrow.